So what would make a good tool? Not just in Mozilla, but what makes a good tool in general for localization? One thing I've showed you guys is that there are many, many file types. So you can imagine if you're a localizer and you're doing several projects, you have to understand all these different file types just to translate. So what if there was an application or a tool that eliminated the need for you to understand all those various file types? So let's get through what we think makes a good tool. There's a missing layer between the data and the application. So you've seen the way that we present data as the code, and of course you've seen the browser application. What happens in between there? There's a missing layer, and we're working to make that more simple. The other thing about tool development and what makes a good tool is that developers often tend to focus on front-end localization tools, but they don't think about what has to happen in the middle. So they might say, well, here's a web application, just translate all these things. But it doesn't overcome those various complexities with file types. Those tools become strongly dependent on DTD files, which I showed you, property files, PO, getText, XLIF. These are all various file types that exist in the world of localization. And what happens is that developers continually reinvent the wheel. So what we've created is called SILMA, and this is an attempt to start to solve some of these problems. So does anyone know what SILMA is, by the way? I had to Google it myself, and when I Googled it, Google said, are you sure you didn't mean slime? So SILMA is actually a letter in the Tengwar alphabet. Tengwar is just a fantasy language that was in some Lord of the Rings book by one of our developers who was really a big fan of it, and he came up with the name. I'm actually encouraging him to change that name so that it becomes a little bit easier for people to understand what we're trying to do. But basically, the goals of SILMA are to create generic L10N operations. We want that format independency that I keep talking about. Source independency. So is your code being housed in a repository like CVS? Is it SVN? HG? These are all things that are basically in different places where the file can be sourced from. Platform independency. Mac, Windows, Linux, it doesn't matter. So we basically want to make localization easier over time. We're targeting tool developers, localizers with some programming knowledge, application developers. So you don't have to be a localizer. If you take any interest in languages and you're a developer, we'd love to have you contribute. And then people who might have experience with build systems, building software, releasing software. Okay, so I mentioned SILMA is generic. It has what we call a strong diff support. That basically means you can take one file, extract the differences between another file, and then work on those differences. This is something we see a lot in the world of localization. Because new versions of the browser come out, changes have been made. How do we find those differences and how do we reconcile them? Very extensible. Extendable format support, we've mentioned this again and again, and it's what we call modular, which basically sets it out in a structure that's very easy to understand. So let me take you through just a couple quick things very easily. These are the different core elements of SILMA. We have what we call entity. So basically, all the problems that I've been describing with that entity, we're creating a new core, and we'll basically identify any file type and create a new thing called the entity inside SILMA. That new entity allows us to do a whole bunch of things with it. So we've seen a lot of this stuff already. Then you can take all those entities and create a new thing called an entity list. So if you're a translator and you're thinking about this stuff, you can now start to line up all of your entities that you need to translate. But this is all file independent, so there's no longer trying to decide what needs to happen or what was it that we were doing. There's what we call the object. This is a little bit more expansive than just an entity list. If you've ever written code or looked at code, a lot of times you'll see there's code written here, and then there's a comment by the developer. And it might say they might insert a comment that should never be coded, or it's not any code. It just says, when you're localizing this, make sure you do that. Or it's just a note to everybody so they understand the code. We may want to import that stuff, so we created an object. It's more of an explanation here. And then there's the package, which is basically lumps all this stuff together in more of a directory structure. So sometimes things come through and they're more than just these lines of code that need to be translated. Maybe there's an image in there. Maybe there's just some extra information, extra files. We can create an object. Now what we do with all this stuff is we basically create the ability to reconcile differences between what we had and what we now need. So everything that I just mentioned has what we call a mirror class in the diff core. So we can now create differences. So I might create this entity in Silma, and then I might find the difference between a second entity, and then I might apply those differences in a new entity. Okay? Let me give you a very specific example to illustrate this. This happened to us about 2 months ago. We had a group from Africa, and they were localizing in a language called Wolof. And they came very close to finishing Firefox 1.0. They got about 95% of the way finished, and then they just disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. It happens all the time. People get very interested, they get almost there, and then they get busy with their lives, and they can't do it anymore. So we lost touch with them. They came back to us about 2 months ago. Now remember, we're at Firefox 3.1, and they said, we'd like to update our localization. We had about this much done, almost ready for Firefox 1.0, and now we want to do 3.0, or 3.1. Well, you can imagine, a lot changed. Strings were removed, new strings entered, values of those strings changed. And so in the past, if they had come back to us and said we want to participate in Firefox 3.1, we would just say start over. Sorry, you have to start over from ground zero. What we did this time is we went from 1 to 3.1 using Silma. We showed the differences. We created a new entity list. We then showed the difference between what they had in 1.0 and the new entity list. And we gave them this package, and we said, this is all you have to change. And they were right back in the game. So this is how we're going to make localization more powerful and more helpful so that more people can participate. I mentioned that we can have different inputs, source format or source independent, format independent. And now my last thing, I want to show you what we call L20N. Basically the second generation of localization in Mozilla.